I had always dismissed skinwalkers as nothing more than Native American werewolf legends, until last week. A co-worker at my new job told me how much they terrified him. He was from Utah, so it made sense to him. After all, those creatures were part of his culture's folklore. He recommended some YouTube videos on skinwalkers, and naturally, my curiosity got the better of me. I binged 5 or 6 of them that night, and by the end, I understood why he feared them so much. I live in rural South Carolina, far from the regions where skinwalker sightings are common, so I didn't feel too uneasy about it. "They're a Midwestern thing," my coworker had reassured me. "You'd be more worried about Wendigos here," he added with a laugh, but the thought of skinwalkers stuck with me. The next day at work, we joked about it, trying to keep the mood light. I remember telling him about one legend. The more you talk about them, the more they notice you. He just made sarcastic ghost noises. That night, I showed the videos to my fiancée. She was way more creeped out than I had been, but I couldn't stop thinking about them. I got obsessed. I watched more videos, read about them on Reddit, and even looked at fan art. The stories were chilling, but I figured it was all just myth and legend. Then, things started happening. I live in a quiet neighborhood where all the houses are on one side of the street, and across from them is a long stretch of overgrown woods. The woods had belonged to an elementary school that closed down decades ago. Nature had reclaimed it, leaving a tangle of trees and brush. 2 nights ago, I was smoking outside when I heard leaves rustling across the street. I didn't think much of it, probably a deer or something. But then the sound came again, sharper this time, followed by a low, panting noise, like a dog. My stomach twisted. Rabies had been a problem in the area recently, so I looked up, expecting to see some stray dog wandering the woods, but there was nothing. The sounds stopped the second I looked. It felt as if something was watching me. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. I stared into the shadows, but whatever had been there was gone, or hiding. Chills ran down my spine, and every skinwalker story I'd ever read rushed back into my head. I put out my cigarette and rushed inside. The next morning, I took my dog Honey out for a walk. She's a pug, and like my baby. We even taught her to associate pee-pee poo-poo with going to the bathroom, which we thought was adorable. But this morning, something was off. Instead of doing her usual sniffing around, Honey walked to the edge of the yard and sat down, staring across the street, at the exact spot where I'd heard the noises the night before. I tugged her leash gently, trying to get her back to the house, but she wouldn't budge. Her eyes were locked on the woods. A sinking feeling gripped me, and I scooped her up, heading for the front steps. That's when I noticed something strange. One of the Halloween decorations my fiancée had put up, a plastic rose with a fake eyeball in the center, had been ripped apart. The wire stem was torn, its petals scattered across the porch. That night, I told my co-worker about it. He shrugged it off, saying it was probably just the wind and the dog was a stray. But I had my doubts. When I got home from work that night, I heard it again. The same panting sound, followed by the scraping of claws against the asphalt. I turned just in time to see a dog running down the street, its coat mangy, its body twisted unnaturally. Its back leg was mangled, hanging limp, yet it moved fast, disappearing into the woods. But that wasn't what made my blood run cold. It had no tail. The skinwalker legends say that when they take the form of animals, they never have tails. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was probably just an injured dog. But deep down, I knew better. Later that night, my fiancée asked me to take Honey out again, too scared to do it herself after watching all those spooky videos. Reluctantly, I agreed. I kept her close to the house, trying not to think about the dog or the eerie voice still echoing in my head. As I stood outside, Honey began sniffing the air, her ears twitching. Then I heard it. "Come on, Honey," my own voice called from across the street. I froze. It was my voice, but it sounded wrong, like a recording played on a broken radio. Honey stopped and looked at me, her head tilted, confused. "Come on, Honey, gotta poo-poo," the voice repeated, staticky and distorted. My heart pounded in my chest as I picked her up and bolted for the house. Just before I reached the door, I turned back. Standing by the fence was the dog, its eyes glowing a sickly orange. Its face wasn't right. Its features were twisted like someone had pulled them out of place. That night, I heard footsteps outside my window, pacing back and forth. Then, once again, the voice called out, "Honey." I didn't sleep. I don't know what to do. If anyone knows how to get rid of this thing, please tell me. I'm scared, terrified, really. The stories are true. I just never thought one would come for me. When I was 13, my cousin, who was 12 at the time, and I decided to camp out in our yard. Our family had passed down this property for generations, and it was vast, around 2.5 square miles of open fields, creeks, and patches of dense forest. There was a stretch of 150 yards between our houses, an expanse of grass leading into fields and woods. On that quiet summer night, we thought camping outside would be fun. Little did we know what we were about to experience. We spent the evening setting up an old tent we found in my parents' garage, then had dinner at his place. Around 9 p.m., we headed back to the tent. There wasn't much to do, so we lay in the dark, talking about our plans for the summer. It was a calm, uneventful night, until it wasn't. Around 11 p.m., I got a call from my girlfriend. She was upset, and I spent the next half hour trying to calm her down. My cousin, who had been lying beside me, suddenly grabbed my shoulder. Hard. At first, I thought he was just trying to annoy me, so I brushed him off, telling him to wait. But then he yanked me around, his face pale with terror. He didn't say a word, just pressed a finger to his lips in a silent shushing motion, eyes wide with fear. Before I could even ask him what was wrong, he whispered, "Look at the entrance." I froze. Slowly, I turned toward the opening of the tent, but at first I didn't see anything. Just darkness and the gentle sway of the trees in the distance. I was about to tell him he was imagining things when I heard it. A slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps circling the tent. Now, it's important to note that we lived about 10 miles outside of town. Nobody wandered onto our property unless it was family or a close family friend, and even then, nobody would come out this late at night. But the footsteps continued, the rhythmic sound of someone or something walking just outside the thin fabric of our tent. "Stay down," I whispered, trying to sound braver than I felt. I crawled to the entrance, pulling back the flap just enough to peek outside. There was nothing there, just the quiet, empty field stretching out toward the forest in the distance. I scanned the area, but everything seemed normal. Reluctantly, I let the flap fall back and lay down again. That's when the footsteps started again. This time, slower, closer. It felt like hours passed. as I listened to the strange, creeping footsteps circling our tent, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, but never leaving. My heart pounded in my ears, and I could hear my cousin's shallow breathing beside me. Then, all at once, the sound stopped. That's when I felt it. The undeniable sensation of being watched. I glanced toward the entrance, and there, standing just outside, was a figure. A man, or what looked like a man. But there was something terribly wrong. He was thin, almost emaciated, with filthy skin and wearing what appeared to be ragged animal pelts draped over his body. His eyes, they glowed like an animal's caught in a flashlight beam, but there was no light. Nothing should have made them glow like that. For what felt like an eternity, we stared at each other, me frozen in horror, him unmoving, those eyes locked onto mine. His breath was shallow, measured. I could feel it even from inside the tent. My cousin lay beside me, paralyzed with fear. Then, slowly, the man began to back away, almost casually. He turned and, without a sound, bolted into the direction of the forest, moving faster than any human should be able to. I didn't sleep. Neither of us did. When the first light of dawn broke, we emerged from the tent, half hoping that the terror from the night before had been some shared nightmare. But when we checked the ground, we saw them, bare footprints circling the tent over and over, as if someone had been prowling around all night. But there was something else. Among the footprints were animal tracks, coyote paw prints, mixed in with the human ones. They were erratic, like something was shifting between walking on 2 feet and 4. As we followed the prints, they led to the edge of our field. Halfway across, they changed, bare feet morphing into something else entirely. Hands and feet became smaller, the impressions turning into coyote paw prints. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human. My cousin and I have had more encounters with it over the years. It never fully leaves. We hear it sometimes, those footsteps, that feeling of being watched. It always lingers in the back of our minds. We've both come to believe we've been dealing with a skinwalker, a creature that can change shape, slipping between the form of a man and an animal. But in 2016, I encountered something far worse, something bigger, something I think has been keeping the skinwalker at bay, for now. Here's a rewrite of your story with more vivid tension and suspense. The Thing at my grandparents' farm. I've never been one to believe in the paranormal. For most of my life, I was the skeptic, the one who laughed off ghost stories and strange encounters. But what I've seen and heard at my grandparents' farm shakes me to the core. Something is out there, lurking in the shadows. And whatever it is, I'm convinced it's not human. My grandparents own a large stretch of land in central Missouri, sprawling fields, dense woods, and a few creeks cutting through the property. They've had it for over 40 years. I've been there more times than I can count. But each time I go, a familiar dread creeps in. It's that gut-wrenching feeling like something's watching me, always just out of sight, always just behind me. The first time I felt this presence, I was about 7 or 9. We brought our dog, Spot, a silver lab, to the farm for the summer. He was a good dog, always calm and protective. One afternoon, I was out in the woods behind the house, just wandering. The warm breeze rustled through the trees, and everything was peaceful, until Spot started growling. It wasn't his usual playful growl. This was deep, sinister, and unnatural. I spun around, searching the trees, but I saw nothing. My heart raced as I scanned the woods, trying to figure out what had set him off. Then, out of nowhere, something shot from the brush, so fast I could barely register it. It was gone in a flash like a coyote, but the speed, it was impossible. It didn't make a sound, not even when it burst through the undergrowth, and when I looked at the spot it came from, there wasn't a single imprint or sign that something had been there. I should have been able to see where it was hiding, but there was nothing. Shaken, I ran back to the house, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. A couple of years later, when I was 10, I had my second encounter. We were back at the farm, and I was having a great time with my family as usual. That feeling of being watched was still there, but I'd learned to ignore it. That night, however, things took a turn. I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep when I heard it. A tapping, loud, deliberate taps coming from the window. I sat up, heart pounding, and peeked through the glass. Nothing. No animal, no branches, nothing that could have made that sound. I tried to shrug it off, thinking maybe it was just a random noise, but then, bam! A heavy, thunderous slam against the window, like something huge had collided with it. I jumped up so fast I nearly blacked out. Grabbing a flashlight from the drawer, I shined it out into the yard. Nothing. 10 seconds passed, still nothing. I was about to crawl into my mom's bed when I heard it. A screech. It pierced the night, a sound so raw, so inhuman it made my blood run cold. I can't describe it properly, but it was dark and unnatural, a noise no living creature should be able to make. I sat there, frozen, petrified. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't move. That horrible sound echoed in my ears, leaving me paralyzed. Eventually, I forced myself to move, bolting into my mom's room, too terrified to even wake her up. I just crawled into her bed and lay there, sleepless, replaying that sound over and over. Years passed. I was 13 when the next encounter happened. My grandpa suggested we go deer watching, something we'd done countless times before. We hopped into the Polaris around sunset and drove out to the eastern pasture, where the deer were usually more abundant. As the sun dipped below the horizon, that familiar feeling of being watched returned. But this time, it was stronger, more intense. I wasn't the only one who felt it. My grandpa, usually laid back and full of jokes, went silent. His relaxed expression hardened into something I'd never seen before. Alert, serious. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, constantly glancing around like he was expecting something to jump out at us. Without warning, he made a sharp U-turn and floored the Polaris back toward the house. "Grandpa, what are you doing?" I asked, my voice trembling. "We're heading back," he replied, his tone cold and distant, as if he'd just seen something horrific. He didn't let up on the gas until we were safely back at the house. Once inside, he locked the door and checked the windows, constantly looking over his shoulder. I'd never seen him like this before. Something had rattled him, and that scared me more than anything. Finally, I mustered the courage to ask, "What the hell is going on?" He looked at me with that same cold expression and said, "There's something out there, and it doesn't like strangers." He went on to explain that ever since they'd moved onto the farm, this thing, whatever it was, had been there. He and my mom had both experienced it. It didn't show itself often, but when it did, it made sure you knew it was there. He told me he'd been watching me the entire time, making sure I didn't get hurt, because he knew this creature better than anyone. Since that day, I've refused to go back to the farm. I can't shake the feeling that something terrible would happen if I did. My grandparents have had more strange occurrences since then. My sister's horse, normally calm and friendly, suddenly became skittish after being brought to the farm. The next morning, my grandpa found 3 deep, jagged gashes down its side, like something had clawed at it. They said the horse had run into a fence, but I know better. Then there was Panda, the Jack Russell Terrier my grandparents adopted. 5 days after bringing him home, they found him dead, his neck slashed, and a deep puncture wound in his body. They blamed it on a bobcat or mountain lion, but I don't believe that for a second. Whatever is out there, I don't want to find out what it's capable of. All I know is that it's waiting. I've held on to this story for a while, too scared to share it. It's haunted me, made me question my faith, my sanity, and even my very perception of the world. But I've finally decided it's time to let others know what I've experienced. Maybe by telling it, I can finally move on, or at least that's what I hope. In 2019, I moved westward to Arizona from the quiet, uneventful state of Oklahoma. I've always been a devout Christian, never once considering that there could be entities in existence beyond our ability to understand or control. It's the 21st century, for heaven's sake. If we wanted to find something, we would have by now, right? It was the night before Christmas Eve, December 23, 2018, in a small town called Pack, just north of Phoenix. My friends and I, in the holiday spirit, decided to venture about 5 or 6 miles into the woods on a secluded trail for a bonfire, drinks, and festive cheer. The desert cold was biting that night, and although I had layered up, the wind seemed to slice right through me. Still, the excitement of the evening masked my discomfort, at least for a while. From the moment I got into the car, I felt something was off. A deep sense of unease settled in my gut, like a sickness I couldn't shake. Something told me to stay home. I didn't know what it was, but I ignored it. After all, I didn't want to spoil the night for my friends. We picked up a few others and headed out, music blaring, laughter echoing inside the car. I've always felt at peace in nature, safe in the forest, but that night was different. It may sound cliche, but I swear I could feel eyes on me as soon as we started down that trail. A predator, hidden in the dark, watching and waiting. A year earlier, around Thanksgiving, I had been to this same spot, though it wasn't one we frequented. We were there for the same reason: drinks and a bonfire. That night, I hadn't had anything to drink. I was the one tasked with gathering firewood. I remember standing at the edge of the fire's glow, just about to step beyond its comforting light when something caught my eye. A shadow, a tall figure, darted behind the trees, barely visible in the dim light. I called out to my friends, asking if it was normal for others to be out there, but they didn't even respond. They were too wrapped up in their own world. I stood there, staring at the dark shape that seemed to move with an eerie, bobbing motion, like something floating on water. My mind scrambled for a rational explanation. Maybe a prank, maybe an animal. But when I opened my mouth to shout, no words came. It was as if something was choking me, holding me in a paralyzing silence. And then, without warning, the figure shot off into the woods, faster than anything I'd ever seen. I fell backward, scrambling on the ground, scratching my hands in a frantic attempt to get away. My friends only laughed, thinking I was drunk. I wasn't. I stayed glued to the fire the rest of that night, too terrified to leave its protective light. So, fast forward to that December night, walking down the same trail, the memory of that shadow haunted me. My friends were too busy drunkenly slurring Christmas carols to notice the fear building inside me. I prayed it was just my imagination. The evening continued without incident for a while. To calm my nerves, I took a few sips of Jaeger. I don't usually drink much, but it was Christmas after all, and the alcohol helped me relax. We laughed, sang, and enjoyed the crisp air. But then nature called. I excused myself and wandered about 300 feet from the fire, heading behind a large rock and some fallen trees to relieve myself. The voices of my friends still echoed behind me, faint but reassuring. Then I heard someone call my name. Corbin, one of my friends, was calling out from the woods. I called back, telling him to wait a second. But as I zipped up and turned toward where I thought Corbin was, something stopped me in my tracks. My breath caught in my throat, and my blood ran cold. What I saw was not Corbin. At first, I couldn't process what I was looking at. A tall, dark figure, at least 7 feet in height, stood in the shadows. Its eyes glowed, burning like embers, reflecting the moonlight. It was hunched over, moving from all fours to standing upright, revealing a grotesque, slender shape. Its skin glistened with an unnatural sheen, like something not of this world. Terror seized me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The thing stared at me with those fiery eyes, and for a moment, everything stopped. Time itself seemed to slow down as my mind spiraled into panic. I did the only thing I could think to do. I dropped to my knees and began to pray, muttering desperate pleas to God, hoping, praying for salvation. The creature let out a sound I will never forget, an unholy shriek, like a person screaming underwater, gurgling and inhuman. It pierced through the silence of the night, shaking me to my core. With all the strength I could muster, I lunged backward and ran, stumbling and falling through the underbrush. Every fall felt like a death sentence. I was sure it would grab me at any moment, that I would feel its claws tear into me. When I finally reached the fire, I collapsed, covered in dirt, sweat, and tears. I tried to explain to my friends, but my words were a mess of sobs and gasps. They stared at me, half believing, half doubtful, unsure if I was just drunk or genuinely terrified. I must have had some sort of panic-induced seizure because the rest of the night was a blur. The last thing I remember is looking back into the darkness and seeing it, those eyes glowing, watching me. And then it smiled. A few days after Christmas, I reached out to a native elder in town. I was terrified of telling him what had happened, afraid he'd think I was crazy. But to my surprise, he listened quietly, nodding as I described every detail. When I finished, he simply said, "That was a skinwalker." He blessed me thoroughly and warned me to stay away from that land. "Next time," he said, "you might not be so lucky." I didn't need to be told twice. I haven't been back since, and I never will. Even now, sometimes, when I look out my window at night, I see those eyes in the trees, staring back at me, waiting. And I can never shake the feeling that one day it'll come for me again.